Hello and welcome to EURACTIV's Agrifood podcast. I'm Julia Dahm.
And I'm Natasha Foote.
And here's your weekly update on all things agriculture and food in the EU from EURACTIV's Agrifood news team.
This week, more on the Industrial Emissions Directive and a chat on the upcoming Sustainable Food Systems Law.
Well, hello, there we are again.
Here we are again.
And there we are again with a topic that, we've visited several times before already, an old friend or an old frenemy, shall we say.
I think frenemy is potentially the
love-hate relationship.
Exactly.
Between everyone involved. Yeah, we're talking about the Industrial Emissions Directive. So just a quick recap. This is a directive that it's broader than agriculture, but it concerns agriculture, and it's about reducing non-CO2 emissions, basically. So it's about reducing emissions of industrial installations, and the everlasting question is which agricultural, specifically livestock farms, should count as industrial installations and should fall under the emission rules of this directive. So that's the backdrop of our discussion here.
The big question here. Yeah. And of course, it ends up being quite contentious because where you draw the line, what the threshold is of what, who gets to say which farm is industrial or not is obviously a pretty a delicate issue, shall we say? Hot topic. And so this week, I actually got my hands on a leaked draft of the compromise text from member states. So basically, this is the minister's general approach to the Industrial Emissions Directive. And this is going to be presented at the meeting of environment ministers on the 16th of March. And it's quite interesting because obviously it puts forward, what they're going to push for on this file. There were a couple of things that stood out to me that were pretty interesting. I would say probably one of the most interesting is that this compromise text wanted to exclude the rearing of pigs and cattle that were used in extensive production systems. Now, extensive production systems, I actually had to look this up. Do you know what this is, Julia?
No, I feel like intensive kind of makes sense, and then you assume that extensive is the opposite, but that's about as far as it goes.
That's exactly what it is. So basically, extensive agriculture is exactly what you said, the opposite of intensive farming. So it's a low input production system. It primarily relies on natural, semi-natural grassland. It has very small inputs of labor and fertilizers and capital, at least relative to the land area that's being farmed. And so here we're talking mainly things like, raising sheep and cattle on mountainsides and like hill farming, things like this, where it's, there's a lot of land, but not a high amount of productivity. And so this was talking about how livestock that were raised in these extensive farming systems shouldn't be included in the Industrial Emissions Directive, although it did recognise the need to expand the current directive to include more pig, poultry and cattle farms. So that there was that. It says, yes, we do need to do this. We acknowledge that, it causes significant pollutions, but they want this extensive farming to be exempt from the directive. And the other thing that was quite interesting is that the compromise text puts forward suggestions basically to kind of stagger the rollout of the Industrial Emissions Directive based on the size of the farm. So instead of saying, this size of farm immediately comes under the directive, they kind of wanted a more of a stepwise approach. So it said that the directive should only really come into play on the ground within 4 years if a farm has a capacity of 600 livestock units. And livestock units are one of these technical terms that we love.
I think we should start calling them cow equivalents, because that's basically what it is.
It's
like
true.
One livestock unit is one adult cow. Or the equivalent amount of a different animal.
Exactly. Cow equivalents. I quite like this. We should try and get this maybe renamed. Let's try and push for this. Because honestly, every time I have to explain livestock unit, what's a livestock unit, et cetera, it's quite complex. Yeah, you're right. Basically, it's the equivalent of one grazing adult dairy cow producing 300,000 kilograms of milk annually. It's quite specific. And then, as you said, the other kinds of livestock are that's used as a basis. So there's more pigs and then even more chickens that that add up to one livestock unit. And so they were saying that basically it should only impact it should only come into force within 4 years for farms that have a capacity of 600 livestock units, within 5 years for those with 400 livestock units, and within 6 years for those with a capacity of 250 livestock units and more. And just for reference, the Commission's current proposal is for the directive to impact farms with 150 livestock units or more. So these numbers we're talking about here are nowhere near the realm of, the kind of current proposal, and nowhere near the timeline as well. So it's going to be interesting to see how, if this is the compromise text that's put forward, how they're going to manage to bridge that gap, because it's a pretty big one. So those are the kind of interesting things that I pulled out of the compromise text, and you can read the article that's on EURACTIV, but also following the theme of the Industrial Emissions Directive. This week, we actually managed to catch up with EU Agriculture Commissioner Janusz Wojciechowski, and I managed to ask him a few questions to hear his perspective on the Industrial Emissions Directive and the discussion around it and the controversies. So I managed to get a little clip, and here is what Commissioner Wojciechowski had to say.
I wanted to ask you, we didn't touch upon the Industrial Emissions Directive. You spoke about livestock farming in there and the impact on small farmers. And there's been a lot of criticism over the proposal of 150 livestock units for small farmers. And there's a lot of discussion about this around this right now. I just wondered if your take on this and its impact on small farmers, whether you still stand by the 150 livestock units in the proposal.
The initial proposal was 100. It was my initiative to increase to the 150 livestock units. But generally, this is a controversial directive, and there is discussion across the member states. I presented also my reservation for this directive, because there is not only the question of the number of livestock, but the most important is the methods of the farming, like especially in the cattle farming, they are farms with for summer grazing, with extensive grazing. This is not similar to industry. This is a question of the sectors and first of all the type of farming.
We've had criticisms from member states, also from the Agri Committee in the Parliament. I was just wondering your take on those criticisms that the figure of 150 livestock units is too low or too high for small farmers.
No, because I say again, this is not the main question of the numbers of livestock units, because this is the different situation is the sector, the peak farms, different in the cattle farms, different in the poultry farms. This is the Commission position is 150 livestock units. I'm member of the Commission. I have to support the Commission position. No, the officially, but I think that I'm sure that this is. We should more into account the specific situation across the sector. And first of all, the method. If there is in the farm over 150 livestock units, the farms can be also sustainable, no industrial. This is not the question of the number of units.
There was recently a lot of backlash because there was evidence that the data that the proposal was based on was from 2016 rather than from more recent data, and that this would impact a higher proportion.
Yes. I know this problem, but when my explanation is then when this draft of regulation was prepared, the last available data were from 2016. Now we have the data from 2020. After that census, it was the reason. But of course, we need to our decision should be based always on the actual data. But there is the problem to know the system of collection data. We have not always the last data.
So should it be changed now, revised based on the 2020 data, do you think, to take that into account?
Yes, this is the new situation, because we have observed the process of concentration of the farms in some member states. Yes.
And this week for our guest on the podcast, we're speaking with Isabel Paliotta. And Isabel is a policy officer for sustainable food systems at the green NGO, the European Environmental Bureau. And we're talking to Isabel about this upcoming sustainable food systems law, what it is and what we can expect from this, but also about the leak of an impact assessment. This is the impact assessment that comes ahead of the law. And she had a little look at it and we're going to hear her take. So here's what she had to say. Let's talk about this framework firstly. We're expecting this sustainable food systems law proposal this year. What is this? Maybe you can give us a quick overview for our listeners. What do we know about this so far?
So far, we know that, the framework was announced in the Farm to Fork strategy back in 2020, and with the intention of ensuring that, and I'm quoting here, products placed on the EU market are increasingly sustainable, and initiating a transition to sustainability in the European food system. So that is a pretty ambitious feat. What that will specifically entail, as far as we know, will be an enabling framework. That's the wording that's been used by the Commission more lately. So a sort of overarching frame defining general definitions, principles and objectives for the whole EU food system.
Pretty ambitious task, as you said. It's quite a big undertaking. And so this week we saw there was this leaked impact assessment of the proposal, basically evaluating different kind of policy options under the Sustainable Food Systems Law. And I know you've taken a look at this as well. And I'm curious to hear from you, what perhaps for you is the most interesting take-home messages from this? Was there anything that stood out to you as particularly good or particularly bad, as the case may be? What were your kind of initial thoughts on this?
My initial reaction when I saw it was, wow. Once again, this is a big piece of work, and the amount of work that has clearly gone into it shines through. Recognizing the progress that has been done within the Commission in terms of framing is I think the first point. Clearly, the problem is being taken very seriously by the Commission, and they've made great progress and a great effort in defining the problem, defining the scope of action, which is the whole food system. So it's something that is very difficult even to think about, let alone frame in a piece of legislation. But they clearly spell out that actors in the food system do not systematically operate sustainably, and that current food environments sort of predispose consumers and other food system actors to make unsustainable choices, and that the middle chain, so that's retail, advertisers, manufacturing, have a disproportionate influence in shaping those food environments and therefore our diets. And definitely the recognition of policy incoherence in EU food policy as being a main obstacle to transition to increased sustainability. I'd say those are the top positive takeaways from that in terms of framing. In more concrete terms, they list a number of preferred policy options relating to, labeling, food sustainability labeling, sustainable public procurement, and minimum sustainability requirements. And if I'd have to go and pick a really positive one, I'd say it's the preferred policy option for sustainable public procurement.
So you mentioned mandatory requirements for sustainable public procurement. Maybe you can just talk us through that a little bit. So public procurement, what does that really mean? Mandatory requirements, is that something you're in favor of? What kind of impact do you see this having? Because it does put a strong emphasis on public procurement. So, how impactful do you see that being?
Yeah, public procurement has been often defined in talking about food system transition to sustainability as low-hanging fruit. The reason for that is that addressing public procurement means harnessing public purchasing power to make sure that the food that is served in all public canteens, in institutions and so on, is as sustainable as it possibly can be, which would seem like a sort of obvious thing, given that it's the food being served by the authorities making the laws about food sustainability. And we are definitely in favor of mandatory criteria for public procurement. and which is actually the preferred policy option that is mentioned in the impact assessment, option 3B. So option 3, sorry. So yeah, the introduction of mandatory general and specific requirements, and that translates into a general requirement to procure food sustainably in public institutions. And also the impact assessment includes a clear reference to both environmental and social health dimensions of sustainability. So we're very, let's say, impressed with that level of ambition on public procurement. It is the most ambitious policy option listed. And I definitely say that's a very big positive signal coming from the impact assessment.
Yeah, it definitely stood out to me as one of the more, as you said, it was the most ambitious option listed, and it was the one that they also said they preferred. And let's talk about another thing you mentioned there, sustainability labeling. So this time it didn't go for the most ambitious option that was listed. They spoke about voluntary harmonized sustainability labeling. What was your take on how important you think it is to have a sustainability labeling system, and if it's voluntary, kind of harmonized across the EU, how impactful do you think that could be, really?
Yeah, well, the thing about labeling, regardless of the policy option you go for, is that it's when you're trying to affect the consumption side and really shift diets, shift consumption choices, shift consumer behaviors in retail environments. It's just a complementary policy measure. It doesn't mean it's useless. It can be very helpful, and it definitely is key in terms of improving transparency and availability of information to consumers. But there is plenty of research showing how labeling has limited effectiveness on its own in shifting consumer behavior. So when we talk about shifting consumption and diets, which is absolutely key if we're aiming to make our food system more sustainable, labels can only go that far. But what you would need is a consistent and cross-cutting food environment approach that really aims at changing the context and the signals and the incentives at the retail level and around consumer decision making, so as to make the healthiest and most sustainable option the most affordable, attractive, advertised, and available one.
You've been fairly positive, really, about the impact assessment so far, but there's also some areas, perhaps, are there some areas, that's the question actually, that you think that it could actually be improved? Were there some areas that you think that it was a bit weak or maybe a bit vague?
We were pretty disappointed to see that there was no reference to targets whatsoever. We find that quite worrying, in that the explanation for that also is that apparently setting EU-wide targets is impossible due to the complexities of the food system, although it has actually been done in other policy areas, such as with climate, where setting climate targets has really allowed the public and private sectors to focus their efforts and sort of redirect their long-term strategies and investments towards a clear goal in a clear direction. And we need the same for food sustainability. And that also leads me to another sort of negative point that I noticed in the impact assessment, which is governance. Because if we think about breaking down targets across member states and their extremely diverse food systems, these would obviously have to be translated, undoubtedly a very complicated process, but in order to fit national contexts. And in order to do that, what you need is governance tools that can allow to translate EU-wide objectives, which we know will be set in the framework, to national contexts. So how to do that, what those tools would look like, there's a variety of options. One could be some sort of national strategic plan, national sustainable food plan, to adapt to national circumstances. And these would also help with member state buy-in, because food policy is quite a thorny area to deal with at the EU level, and it hasn't so far. Everyone has an opinion on food, and it's so intimately tied to our identity, our culture, our history, that of course it's going to be difficult for member states to buy into an EU-wide direction of travel, let's say. But at the same time, as is clearly recognized in the impact assessment, the problems we need to address transcend national borders. In some cases, they're global. So if we want to achieve that much needed transition, we really need to have a consistent approach. And one last point I want to make on governance is not only about translating objectives to the national level and getting member state buy-in, but it's also really relevant for social sustainability. The food system is defined at this point nearly by extreme power concentration. And that also translates to unequal access to policy-making fora, participation in decision-making processes, and so on. So we really need better mechanisms for citizens' engagement and robust rules for public participation. So I'd say on the aspect of governance, there was quite a bit of vagueness in the impact assessment. I think the wording is some policy governance tools or something like that, but no further definition is given, and that's quite concerning. It's really tough to draw up something to work on food systems and so on, but we really need to do that. And right now, the framework is our best shot. It's what we've got.
So that's all from us this week. And this week, like every week, the EURACTIV Agrifood podcast was put together by EURACTIV's Agrifood team. That's Julia Dam and Natasha Foote, with the technical support of Evie Chiori.
This podcast is also available on all major streaming platforms, including Apple, Amazon, Stitcher, and Spotify.
Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss the latest news from the EU. I'm Natasha Foote. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.